The prison does not prevent antisocial acts from taking place. It increases their numbers. It does not improve those who enter its walls. However it is reformed, it will always remain a place of restraint, an artificial environment like a monastery, which will make the prisoner less and less fit for life in the community. It does not achieve its end. It degrades society. It must disappear. The first duty of the revolution will be to abolish prisons, those monuments of human hypocrisy and cowardice. Peter Kropotkin.
Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. As always, it's great to be here with you. I'm going to get right into the subject today, but I did want to leave one note here right at the beginning. The larger justice system in the United States is pretty messed up right now. It's petty, violent, unfair, and the fact that we even call it a justice system is quite often nothing less than a joke. This is especially true for the poor and minorities in this country, in particular in Black and Latino communities. I'm not even shy to say that the justice system itself is, in fact, racist. So although I am absolutely going to talk about this a bit in this episode, I made the conscious decision to not put an extremely heavy focus on that, and I made that decision for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of that stuff has to do with things outside of prison specifically, which is what I want to talk about today. Street policing, courts, geographic segregation, systemic racism, and so on. In this episode, it just isn't directly about that, or at least I didn't think it was as I sit here and I start recording. At the end of the day, I decided that talking about the justice system at large, the broader 30,000-foot view, the police, the shootings, the DAs, the judges, the unfair court system, and so on, it all deserved its own episode, or perhaps even several episodes. So again, while I will bring much of this up as we move along, it won't be super deep. So please take a listen, and if at the end you disagree with that decision, or even if I just didn't do enough in this episode, let me know. This is how, I'll get better at making these episodes. But I hope anyone who thinks I should have decided differently will understand that I made this decision in the best of faith. Okay. A world with no prisons. Do me a favor. Try to imagine the prison system in the United States. Try to imagine all of it. Imagine all of the facilities that exist, the actual buildings that house our millions of prisoners. Imagine all of the prisoners themselves. Picture the guards, the fences, the support staff. Picture the satellite office buildings and all of the parole officers who inhabit them. Now imagine a country where none of those things exist. No prisons dotting the national landscape. No prisoners wasting away within all of those walls. No punitive punishment hellholes. Does a country with no prisons seem at all possible? How about an entire world without prisons? If you're anything like most people, when you tried to think of a world free of prisons, you probably conjured an image in your head that only lasted a brief moment. A flickering few frames of overexposed sepia film that showed a utopian vision before the projector jammed and the fragile film melted over the hot bulb. Then you shook your head as your mind rejected the prospect utterly, and you came back to quote-unquote reality. It's a lot to ask, to reject a lifetime's worth of culture, experience, and beliefs. I understand this completely, yet this is exactly what I'm asking you to do. It's a difficult, slippery thing to imagine that which we've never seen or experienced. It's very difficult to imagine this country in particular without mass incarceration. That's how deeply ingrained the concept of prison is in our society and in our very psyches. There's a book out there called Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. Now, I haven't actually read this book yet, and the book itself isn't really the point here. but there has emerged from it a relatively famous quote that says something close to this. It says, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." He was saying that we are so completely within capitalism that it has become nearly impossible to even think about any other way of life. Another analogy people like to use to express a similar idea is that of a fish in water. How exactly would you convince a fish that they are wet? As far as the fish is concerned, it's just alive. It has no concept of wet. In fact, for that fish, the concept of dry doesn't even exist. It is, in fact, easier for the fish to imagine the end of the world than to imagine being dry, or even understand the idea of being wet, if fish could think in that way. And if I got that analogy right. But anyway, I think about that capitalist realism quote when I think about prison. It kind of hurts my brain to even consider prison abolition sometimes. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of prison. Like, what? What? And truth be told, this is one of only a very few subjects that I've covered here so far or in my old blog where I went into the research certain of one outcome and got another almost entirely opposite result of what I expected. In fact, when I started my blog, prison abolition was on my initial list of 20 or so potential things to look at to write about. I had 3 columns that I listed things under: agree, I don't know, and disagree. Prison abolition was under disagree. I did not agree with it. I was sure that I'd be even more against it after reading into it more deeply. It sounded so obviously ridiculous right on the surface. Then I started reading and listening and completely changed my own mind. Now I know what you want to ask. It's the first thing everybody wants to ask. Okay, smart guy, what would we do with bad people? And shortly after that, no matter how I respond, there will probably be a question like, well, what about really bad people? What about murderers? What about the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world? And it is almost always Jeffrey Dahmer. And you were thinking about Dahmer too, weren't you? It's okay. Everybody does. And I will talk about the Dahmers of the world a little later, but let's set the extreme outliers, the Dahmers, aside for a few minutes and deal with some of the more banal folks who currently reside behind razor wire, chain link fences, reinforced concrete walls, and steel bars. It seems pretty simple on its face. When a human being transgresses against the rules, when they do something which harms an individual or society, we throw them into jail or prison to separate them from the population. That's just how it is. How else could it be? Let's take a look at the origin of the carceral species. Prison itself, in the form of penitentiaries which utilize imprisonment of people as punishment for their crimes, is more or less a relatively new concept. Historically, jails were merely places to hold criminals until they were tried and sentenced. Most sentences, when passed, were corporal or capital. Physical punishment, banishment, and we might note here England's penchant for sending people to Australia, and forced servitude, especially into its colonies, were amongst other far more creative and abusive forms of punishment. The harshest punishment, of course, was death. These murders were typically both brutal and gruesome and often served as a public spectacle. One of, if not the single most notable places of hanging in the history of hanging places, was at Tyburn Manor, an estate in Middlesex County, England. The first hanging at the Tyburn Crossroad was in 1196, and they would continue, as we will see, for some long amount of years. In fact, so many people were taken from Newgate Prison to be hung at Tyburn that a permanent gallows, designed as a triangular 3-legged stool design so that 3 or more prisoners could be hung at a time with plenty of elbow room, was erected in 1571, almost 400 years after that first hanging. The permanent gallows would soon become known as the Tyburn Tree. About 1,200 people were hung over the years from that Tyburn Tree, 100 of whom were women. The hangings would go on until 1793, nearly 600 years of cruel murder. So as the hangings at Tyburn end, we move into the 1800s when the vast majority of long-term prisoners, as we currently conceive the concept, were in debtors' prisons. They were typically more or less innocent people, aside from falling behind on debt, whose creditors initiated legal actions, and they were held in prison until they or their families were able to pay off those debts. This running story of execution and incarceration begins to change, just like the Tyburn crossroads in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Philosophers and social reformers, men like Jeremy Bentham, began to reject corporal and capital forms of punishment as ineffective and inhumane, and sought more efficacious and less cruel alternatives. But aside from a general distaste for the perceived cruelty of these punishments, the reformers of the day, and it is important to note that these people were indeed trying to be reformers, they were very much of the belief that the status quo was cruel and must be changed. But they had another issue as well. That issue being that fewer people were being found guilty of crimes. Criminals were, in essence, more often than they really should be, in their mind at least, getting away with it. One of the major reasons for this is, well, the prominence of corporal punishment, and especially the death penalty. Children as young as 12 and 13, maybe even younger, would sometimes be severely beaten or even killed for stealing something as small as a loaf of bread or an apple. It wasn't super often, but it did happen. Now imagine if you were a juror in this time. Now you're sitting on a jury and a 13-year-old boy is charged with stealing a few apples. A few people even saw him running away with the apples. His guilt is clear. But you look at the judge and you know that he could sentence that boy to a beating, a lashing, or even to his death by hanging. But you know that no apple is truly worthy of a beating, let alone the taking of a life. So what do? Maybe you just let him go. I mean, if the boy is found guilty, the judge could just make him pay the apple seller or send him away for a day or two in the stocks. And maybe you can accept that. But he could also send him to Australia or to the Tyburn Tree. You just don't know. So you say, not guilty. And this was happening throughout England. Criminals were, in the view of people like Bentham, getting away with it. And when they didn't get away with it, they were being punished way too harshly. These people wanted criminals to pay for their crimes and for people to be okay with it. So Bentham decided to revolutionize punishment. Bentham would then design his ideal version of a humane prison, which he called the Panopticon, which is a pretty badass name. The Panopticon was essentially a ring of cells with a central guard room. All of the cells would be walled on three sides, with the fourth wall being made of bars and facing the center of the ring. In the center of that ring was a guard room with a 365-degree field of view. The idea was that a single guard could see into each cell of the cell ring, but the prisoners would not be able to see into the tower due to tinted glass or some other method. Because the guards could not be seen, but they could see the prisoners, Bentham surmised that the prisoners would be forced to behave for fear of being caught and punished. Now, true panopticons were never built, and Bentham remained chagrined by this to his dying day. But their basic ideas, cells, small numbers of guards, central observation, and so on, they inform prison design to this very day. Nevertheless, the basic foundations of imprisonment as a more humane punishment on both moral and physical levels began to coalesce. Yes, Bentham and others viewed long-term prison sentences as far more humane than humiliation, physical abuse, and death. In fact, many early prisons adopted isolation, what we'd call solitary confinement, as the most humane form of punishment and rehabilitation, especially here in the New World. After all, The time alone in your cell with nothing but your clothes, a Bible, and perhaps a sleeping mat would allow you to read the Bible, if you were literate, and otherwise pray and meditate. A true ascetic paradise meant to repair your soul by giving you the twin blessings of time and solitude to get closer to God. These reformers, though well-meaning, were incorrect about solitary confinement in the most disastrous of ways. In fact, we know that isolation is one of the most fundamentally degrading and damaging things that we can do to the human soul and psyche. Now, in a modern sense, I'm going to be talking a lot about the punitive nature of the American prison system. Its goal being to punish rather than to help those who are caught within it. And this is all true, I believe. But I do want to note here that it has not always been this way. There have been off and on periods of actual reform and of actual attempts at rehabilitative justice. But all of this, as ham-fisted and spotty as it was, got completely thrown out the window around 1970 or so. Now let's talk about the destruction of society.
Prisons do not disappear problems, they disappear human beings. Angela Davis.
When the accepted solution to societal issues is to hide people behind prison walls rather than fix the root causes, we only turbocharge our problems. We don't solve them. Many advocates for prison use, or even just for maintaining the status quo with criminal punishment, talk about prison being a deterrent. But I'm left to ask this: exactly what are they deterring? And then I'm left to ask this: if prisons did in fact work as deterrents, then why do we keep having to build more and more prisons? Why are they always full? Shouldn't the prison system have deterred itself right out of existence? I mean, it should, right? If it worked as a deterrent? Here's the thing, though. They don't deter anyone. And instead of the prison industry shrinking, it continues to grow. And now, as the prison industrial complex grows, it demands to be fueled, and unfortunately for humanity, but especially unfortunate for the poor and oppressed, that fuel is nothing less than human life and dignity. Even worse, if it even can be any worse, is the fact that as incarceration has become the accepted form of punishment for more and more transgressions, we have made more and more actions into transgressions. They, in turn, then become prisonable offenses. And even those offenses that aren't typically resulting in arrests or jail time, they do in fact result in fines. And those offenses become, for poor people, warrants. And those warrants become arrests, and lost jobs, and ruined lives. Felonies themselves begin to come with longer sentences. Misdemeanors start to become felonies, civil offenses become criminal, and so on. Too often, these crimes are disproportionately crimes committed by the poor and the homeless. Things like petty theft and failure to pay fines from extremely minor offenses, or, like we are now seeing in places like Los Angeles and Austin, Texas, simply being homeless has become illegal. Often people spend just insane amounts of time in jail just waiting for trial. This is not because these people are dangerous or a flight risk. They are simply poor. Often they are completely innocent and are locked up for no reason other than owing money or being unable to afford bail. Hell, sometimes they're just the wrong guy who fit the description, aka being a black guy on the wrong street, and they are completely innocent. Many times people will be held for months or even years, only to see the charges get dropped due to lack of evidence. Meanwhile, their life has been destroyed. Their job, which they barely got by on to begin with, is gone. Wives or husbands or partners may have even left them. Add more broken families to the docket, prosecutors. Prospective employers wonder why this person has a 6-month gap in their work history, or they simply won't hire anyone who's even been charged with a felony. Even worse than that are all of the people who have been arrested and are represented by an overworked public defender. Virtually none of these cases even go to trial because of harsh sentencing requirements. Even innocent people can be cajoled into pleading guilty and taking a 6-month sentence with a chance to get out after 2 months with good behavior, especially when they face a 10-year minimum if they try to fight it. Even if they plead and get time served, that's still a felony on their record, which further erodes any employment opportunities they may seek. Now, obviously, this argument about the unfairness of the broader criminal justice system isn't just about prisons, but it also is related to them. Prisons do not represent fair punishment. They are totems that remind us that punishment is not about who is and is not guilty or deserving or undeserving. It is only about who can afford to defend themselves and buy their way out of vengeful violence and those who can't. The rich do crimes and walk. The poor people and the minority people have their lives snatched from them before they even get a chance to start them. Prison does not realistically exist for everybody, even if they were effective. Prison is reserved almost exclusively for the most impoverished and oppressed people in this country. This poor-to-prison pipeline just keeps pumping human flesh into the teeth of that giant meat grinder. Too often, as we lock people up, we only cause more harm. The so-called war on drugs has not even begun to make even the slightest of dents in the supposed scourge of illegal drugs, both locally and nationally. And it's not only that. Prisons themselves are one of the most cruel and violent places in all of society. We force these predominantly young people to adapt to a depraved, predatory environment, and then we demand that they somehow reform themselves, and then expect them to step back into the streets a changed person. Which is completely and totally absurd. And let's talk about stepping back into the streets with nothing at all but whatever skills they picked up to survive prison and a felony on their record. What then? When individuals leave prison as a felon, it immediately weakens their chance to make good, even if the prison had reformed them. They can't find work, can't take care of themselves, and can't find safe housing away from bad influences. They get all of those advantages and nothing to offset them. Because at the end of the day, the need to survive, and I literally mean survive here, well, it just remains. What would you do to escape something like a group home ravaged with drugs and crime? What would you do when you haven't eaten properly in days? What would you do if you saw your family in that same state? I'd steal. Sure as shit I would steal. All we have done in this misguided attempt to save the country is to destroy individual after individual, ruin life after life, tear apart family after family, and fracture community after community. Mothers and fathers gone, children shunted into the system where they flounder, and the cycle perpetuates itself. And this destruction, this absolute decimation of communities, is disproportionately directed at impoverished communities and communities of color.
Instead of asking whether anyone should be locked up or go free, why don't we think about why we solve problems by repeating the kind of behavior that brought us the problem in the first place? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, The Golden Gulag.
That incarceration has become the de facto solution to so many of society's ills is deeply problematic, to say the least. When we incarcerate to punish, we do two particular things. We destroy entire communities, most of which are historically oppressed to begin with, because we've been pretty goddamn racist in this country for so goddamn long. And by doing this, we do nothing less than concentrate the sorts of situations which propagate even more of the crimes which we intended to dissuade. This results in the poor and minorities being disproportionately affected by the legal system, which chews them up with utter contempt. Let's talk a little bit more about the growth of the prison system. And let me just take a break here to say something. When I read about this next part, it blew my already extremely cynical mind. It still does. It almost physically hurts to think about this. In the 1970s, the Congressional Research Service found a very strong correlation between being unemployed and ending up incarcerated. Perhaps the best view to take of this entirely unsurprising factoid would be to try to increase employment in areas with a lot of unemployed people. After all, keeping people out of prison should be the priority here, right? Surely nobody could look at that factoid and think that the solution to this problem was to build more prisons. Right? Right? Wrong. In fact, the federal government decided that the proper response to the findings in this report was to encourage states to build even more prisons by subsidizing 75% of new prison construction costs. Yes, that is how absolutely sick this country is. Rather than focus on preventing people from entering the prison system by doing something like maybe creating jobs, they simply subsidized a massive prison expansion. Let's talk about the carceral state. This prison expansion had several aspects to it, but I don't want to drift too far down the prison economics rabbit hole. But let's just hit a few things before we move on, because I think some of this stuff is important to at least note. Most of these new prisons went to rural areas. After all, the NIMBY crowd, the not in my backyard folks, they wouldn't want a prison looming over their subdivision, right? So they went to remote areas. And for these remote areas, prisons were a boon to the local economy, at least for a little while. The whole chain of events starts with the state buying land from farmers. And then, sure, the prisons brought jobs, but they also brought monopsony power to these rural outposts. Often the prison itself, or the few companies which service the prison and its employees, were the only employer in the area. And those service companies, they relied directly on the prison. By doing this, the prison actually was able to depress wages for the entire economic area. There is also another interesting twist to this sick joke of a system, and that revolves around the census, which then affects voting and representation. Prisoners are considered residents of the locale in which they are imprisoned, and they artificially boost the populations of towns, counties, and congressional districts, and that changes how the people of the state and the country are represented. Now, I'm not a big fan of throwing stats out there when discussing stuff like this because, frankly, anyone can take numbers and twist them to their narrative. And because of that notion, I just don't think that stats are very helpful in changing people's minds or reinforcing an argument. But I'm going to give you a few anyways. These numbers are all directly from the Justice Department. In 2019, 2.15 million Americans were incarcerated. This means that for every 100,000 citizens, 655 were inmates. The cost of this incarceration is in the neighborhood of $80 billion per year. An additional 4.5 million adults were on parole or probation. In the most recent national estimates, people were booked into jail 10.7 million times over the course of 2018, roughly 5 times the number of people incarcerated in jails and prisons on an average day. I could find no reliable number for the total cost of monitoring parole and probation, but one would have to assume that the number would be just as staggering. The best thing I could find was that states spend about $3 billion a year locking people back up for non-criminal rules violations while on parole. In other words, they committed no new crimes. Think about things like breaking curfew or failing to pay expensive supervision fees. Yes, the people out on the streets with no money, no training, and no resources, while also struggling to find a decent job because of their convictions, are actually expected to pay fees for the service of their parole officers. It's just sick. If we add that all up, then about 6.7 million adults were under correctional supervision, probation, parole, jail, or prison, and that's not counting the people rolling in and out of jails for a few hours or for a night. This is about 2.8% of the adult population of the country, or 1 out of every 35 people. Oh, and there are also over 50,000 children being detained as of 2019, with over 4,200 of them being incarcerated in adult facilities. And since we're here, let's just hit a couple of racial breakdown stats. By age 23, 49% of black males and 44% of Hispanic males will have been arrested. By age 23, 38% of white males have been arrested. The black and Hispanic males will have been given harsher sentences than the white males when other factors such as previous arrests and so on are factored in. According to attorney Antonio Moore, writing for HuffPo, there are more African American men incarcerated in the U.S. than the total prison populations in India, Argentina, Canada, Lebanon, Japan, Germany, Finland, Israel, and England combined. There are only 19 million African American males in the United States, but collectively these countries represent over 1.6 billion people. Now take a moment to sit back and think about how many families are irrevocably damaged by these numbers, and consider where most of these people tend to live. Now think about how many neighborhoods are decimated as the families who would create the community in that neighborhood fall apart. From there, it's not hard to imagine how entire communities, broken by the so-called justice system, can further erode localized society in broader swaths of their larger cities and towns. Incarceration as punishment is so prevalent and so accepted that it has become inseparable from our culture itself. The result of such strong societal and cultural integration is that many people have come to view the carceral state as not only a simple but necessary evil, but as a somehow integral part of Western society. And as we think about that integration in Western society as we view the racial and class makeup of prisoners in the United States, a question has to be asked. Is Western civilization and Western society like a mere euphemism for either a generalized plutocracy or a caste system of supremacy? And this isn't even, to broach the racial aspects of Western, read European and white, civilization, and our predominantly black and Hispanic prison population. A couple more stats presented with the same caveat as before. As of September 30th, 2009, 7.9% of federal prisoners were incarcerated for violent offenses. 92% nonviolent. How is this even real? As of 2008, 52% of prisoners in state facilities were convicted of violent crimes. 48% were necessarily nonviolent. Yes, these numbers are pretty old right now, but I couldn't find anything newer. So there may have been some changes here, but honestly, do we think that those changes are on anything but the edges? According to the Prison Policy Project, 1 in 5 incarcerated people are there for nonviolent drug offenses. That's 20% right there who are nonviolent. And even when we look at the number of violent offenders, we need to keep in mind that these numbers can be skewed. We need to think about a situation where, say, 5 men rob a bank and a 6th one sits outside as the getaway driver and lookout. Then if one of the 5 men inside kills a bank employee, then all 6 can be charged with murder, despite all 5 of them not pulling the trigger, and one of them not even being in the building. And now, I'm not saying that laws like this inflate the number to a massive degree, but we should definitely think about it. Is Chuck the getaway driver really a violent felon in this scenario? I'd also point out that violent criminals are actually less likely to be rearrested than those who steal or fail to pay a fine or something small. The recidivism rates are actually really low. The reality is that the serial murderer that we all fear, the true scary monster, they're extremely rare. Most murders are crimes of passion and circumstances which are usually unlikely to ever happen again. we should think about this and whether life sentences or long sentences are actually just. All that said, further encroachments of the carceral state and especially for-profit prison systems into our private lives is inevitable. The constant eroding of the freedoms and rights of the non-incarcerated citizen is staggering, and a lot of it is fueled by the prison industry. The strategies, tactics, and surveillance techniques and technologies created by and used within the prison industry have, with disturbing regularity, found their way into our everyday lives. The cameras, surveillance techniques, and crowd control methods that have been created, used, and refined in prisons have been slowly, inexorably folded into the general populace and used against them by the police forces. Now, when I think about prison abolition, I am struck by three basic questions. Can we abolish prison? Should we abolish prison? Will we abolish prison? Can we? First, I want to put a really simple framework around the term prison. When I think about this question, I picture the prison from Shawshank or Oz. I picture Attica, Pelican Bay, and Rikers Island, which I guess is technically a jail, and other similar facilities. I picture local jails, county jails, and prisons, state prisons and federal prisons, right up to the supermax facilities spread across the country. And I think about private prisons. I think about locations where we send people as punishment for behaviors and crimes, where their freedom is taken from them and they are locked in cells, sometimes without the benefit of a trial. Is it possible to abolish these forms of incarceration? I think that it is. The reason I wanted to try to lay out that framework a little bit, even one as general as the above, is that I am not sure that we can literally rid ourselves of all forms of quote-unquote imprisonment. If we include hospitals, mental health institutions, psychiatric hospitals, and so on. It seems to me, and this is for those Dahmer folks out there, that there will always be the aberrant and the truly broken amongst us. But I do want to add that some people very much disagree with me, but I am just not quite there yet. So there may be a time, at least in my view, when people like this will need to be separated from society at large, both for their own protection as well as ours, and their freedom will have to be curtailed in some form or another, up to and including some form of incarceration in one of those other facilities. A hospital, some sort of institution, I don't know. However, I do believe that this can be done, if indeed it must be done, and in all cases, in a more humane, rehabilitative setting that can still maintain safety for all of those involved. Should we abolish prison? To expand this question a bit, can we create a more humane and just society? Undoubtedly. And we should try. If we view this self-perpetuating cycle of incarceration as immoral, then we simply must work towards a morally righteous path to help take care of societal ills. Imagine for a moment how much more could be accomplished if we put as much effort and money into supporting families in difficult situations as we do in tearing them apart. We might end up imagining a world where a more socially open culture dominates, and issues can be nipped in the proverbial bud, either at the family and friend level or the community level before a more serious situation develops. Perhaps a world full of accessible therapy, healthcare, welfare, and spiritual guidance coupled with real material help. As another example, we might imagine what would happen if we spent as much time and money on enrichment as we do on depredation. Not only do we want to rid the world of prisons, but we are also talking about creating a society which truly will give people a real chance to actually live and to actually be free. Will we abolish prison? Obviously, I don't know, but I'm hopeful. Unfortunately, the reason why it may be unlikely is not, I believe, because of our inability to actually do it. The reason is because we lack the ability to even envision it, and because of that, we lack the will. There is certainly a lot to be said about the political and profit-driven motives here, much like the racial aspects. After all, capitalism. But I feel that subject is better served as another episode as well. It should not be so easy to dismiss these ideas as flights of fancy or as utopic dream. When a term like utopic or a word like dream is used as a pejorative in these discussions, it only serves to shun those who aspire to a better world. Like, hey, everybody, look at this loser. He wants a better world. The pursuit of a more just, moral, and noble society should never be so callously dismissed. Perhaps it would be fair to use our own pejoratives back. To those who believe that violence, force, kidnapping, and systemic degradation are the best of all possible ways to fix the things that our current carceral state aims to fix, I label you as dystopians, and I accuse you of harboring inhumane and dystopic views of society at large. So there. But of course, these pejorative, dismissive terms are not fair, not in either instance. We need to do better both rhetorically and materially. Let's talk about some better ways. One thing that our current system of punishment has proven is that retribution for crimes simply does not work as well as we like to pretend it does. It is time to look elsewhere for help. Restorative justice is one such place to look. Restorative justice aims to address crime in a way that helps both the victim and the perpetrator. In the case of a simple breaking and entering, where something of small value was stolen, we may see a situation unfold which looks something like this. 15-year-old Trevor breaks into Linda's home, and he steals a laptop. Trevor is then caught trying to pawn the laptop a few blocks away. A week later, a meeting is held at the community center. Linda is there. Trevor is there. A moderator runs a meeting. Also attending are a clergyman, a counselor, and a notary public. The meeting itself centers who was wronged, what they are owed, and what can be done to dissuade future transgressions from the offender. The results of something relatively minor like this may be something like $100 paid by Trevor to Linda to repair the lock he broke, an apology, and perhaps some work with one of the churches represented by the clergy. Perhaps if lack of money for basic necessities was the root cause of the theft, the clergy or some sort of local group can even help Trevor secure a job somewhere in the community. Maybe one of these local groups even fronts $100 to Linda and lets Trevor work it off with his community work. Linda is happy with her justice, such as it is. As the victim, she was even empowered and given a real voice. Trevor wasn't carted off in a squad car to jail and disappeared. He was given a chance to apologize and to make amends. That was all Linda wanted, not for Trevor's life to be ruined. Trevor was helped as well. He was confronted, sure, but his life wasn't destroyed by a stint in jail, and now he has a job and a better chance at a better life. Additionally, through this process, Trevor sees and hears firsthand how his actions affected Linda. The shock, fear, and the sadness. He is also likely to receive at least some moral and ethical guidance as the process progresses to a conclusion. Also of note is that Trevor is not directly and coldly punished, and the offenders in these situations tend to view their punishments, whatever they may be, as more legitimate, seeing as how the focus is more on making the victim whole as opposed to simply punishing them as harshly as possible. These things are all important, but what is most important here is that restorative justice centers the victim. The victim has the final say every step of the way. The process begins only when the victim asks and agrees to it. It continues only under the consent of the victim, and it ends only when the victim is satisfied or asks for it to end. For sure, this system requires both the victim and the offender to take part, but all of the choices and all of the power are centered around the wishes and consent of the victim. If they say stop, it stops. If they want to talk face to face, that's how they talk. If they will only converse through handwritten notes, then that's the only way it happens. In the example I used, the crime was pretty low level. A door lock got broken and a laptop was stolen. The perpetrator and the victim are both relatively likable and sympathetic. I understand that, and I did that on purpose just to highlight the potential of restorative justice. And yes, since I know at least a few of you are wondering this, restorative justice can be, and has been, used in some of the most heinous crimes we can imagine. Yes, even rape and murder. Am I, as a human being, strong enough to take part in restorative justice for a crime like this if I were the victim? I don't know. I truly don't. But I hope that I'd be that strong. However, I did want to note that the process has been used in violent situations and it can work there. Now contrast this approach with our current methodology. Step 1, who broke the law? Step 2, how can we punish them? Then tag on all the other negatives that come with convictions, things like lowered chance of employment, lack of skills development, poverty, family breakups, and so on. And the question this seems to beg within me is this: which method is more humane? The answer to this question just might be the key. Other options which can be utilized along with restorative justice might include stuff like restitution, an attempt to make the victim of a crime whole again, to replace that which was stolen as an example, or to mow the lawn X amount of times, or do community work, and so on like we talked about before. And community service, work in, around, and for the community as a whole. Work in the community center, clean parks, paint, etc. In or outpatient drug alcohol treatment, in or outpatient psychiatric treatment, or even direct assistance to help those who see no other option but crime. But again, you're probably still saying, what about those people we might consider to be dangerous to society at large? What of them? And this is a tough one to answer because it's not a simple answer. The first thing I try to remember is that prison abolitionists don't generally want to just destroy the prison system tomorrow and just unlock the cells and send people into the streets with their prison uniform, towel, and toothbrush. Instead, they tend to, as far as I've seen and heard, they usually opt for a paradigm encapsulated in this motto: stop, shrink, build. Stop incarcerating people, shrink the prison industrial complex, build the alternatives. And we might even look to the Scandinavian countries for a nudge here. The prisons in several of these countries are famous for their comfort and relaxed attitude. The prisoners wear street clothes. Their cells, if we want to call them that, are more like a pretty decent hotel room. They get TV, and they can go out in the sun and interact with people. They often even have a key to their rooms and can, in fact, lock their doors. We can look at that and point and say, hey, look at this shit. Do we not see this shit? And in fact, we do see this shit. American prison executives have gone to see these places. But where's the profit? And that is one of the hinge points here. How would private companies profit from this? And from the other end, how can American politicians support paying for this, even in a nonprofit, state-run sense? But there's a bigger issue here when we talk about Scandinavia, and that is culture. The Scandinavian countries have their own overwhelming cultural and media narratives just like we do. And these narratives shape their views just as indelibly as ours do our own. Not to mention that they have universal health care, high union rates, and a robust welfare state that helps prevent the situations where crimes for money are necessitated. We lack those last three things. And our cultural tsunami results in a deeply sick and twisted revenge fantasy instead of a more wholesome want to help people. In the States, we all really want to be badass, gun-wielding, cowboy assassin John Wicks, instead of wholesome Doctor Who's using their wit as a weapon, and it shows. But anyway, first steps in this direction are likely decriminalizing things which send people to jail and prison simply for being poor. Vagrancy, unpaid fines, ridding the world of fines themselves actually, and cash bail. Then you start to shrink the system. We could start with releasing nonviolent offenders, hell, even violent offenders as we mentioned before, wherever it makes sense, for example. And while we are working on that, we can build the alternatives. We can create grassroots restorative justice groups. We can help communities heal. We can help communities financially grow. And so what do we do with the truly dangerous, the murderers, rapists, and the Dahmers? Is there an option? I'm not sure that there is. I think that for the first two, rapists and murderers, there are actually alternatives that can be at least considered. But what about the Dahmers? Personally, I have a hard time envisioning this one. Imagine telling a community that a monster who preyed upon them for years and took 10 of their lives would not be sent to prison. It's a hard damn thing to consider. Hell, it's hard for us right now, even for something as relatively benign as a mugging where nobody got hurt. But as hard as it is to consider, we simply must consider it. And not just in the passive sort of, yeah, okay, I thought about it for 5 seconds, but no. That's crazy sort of way. Like, we really need to consider this and work on it. In the best of scenarios, things like community engagement and restorative justice coupled with other alternatives would act together to treat the potential problem at its source long before anything horrible happens. And by this I mean a tight-knit community seeing that something is wrong and acting in compassionate ways to help a person before something horrific happens. And I just want to note that I don't say that flippantly. I'm not suggesting that, spotting a potential cannibalistic serial killer is an easy thing to do, or that it's an easy thing to deal with. But a tight-knit community who knows each other, who spends time in their yards, on their stoops, in the parks, and at community events, it seems like they are far more likely to notice something out of the ordinary. I think. And yeah, I know monsters have lived alongside neighbors in the past. Like I said, I don't have all the answers here myself. And what if we do all that and it fails? What if the best of possible worlds still produces a monster? We might consider things like house arrest or even some form of more humane, quote-unquote incarceration. And this is where, real dyed-in-the-wool hardcore prison abolitionists might be bailing out. Psychiatric lockup, perhaps, except where the patient is treated as a human being and not a monster? I don't know. I wish I had 3 better words to give you other than I don't know. I truly don't have that answer for you. I'm sorry. But like we talked about last episode, I don't think that we need all of the answers as individuals to demand change or even to begin making change. There are a lot of really smart people out there, and we can figure some of this out as we move forward. An answer of, I don't know, is often far more useful than someone who is sure they have the plan all figured out, and it's almost always better than, that's just how it is. In the end, we do not need more prisons because prisons do not work. If the correction system actually worked, it would correct something, wouldn't it? 2/3 of prisoners wouldn't be arrested within 3 years of their release, would they? What are all of these so-called correctional facilities correcting? Seriously, think about what the corrections industry, and it is an industry, is actually correcting. The answer is nothing. Like I said before, if prisons worked, then they would correct themselves right out of existence. We need investment in our communities, our schools, and our physical and mental health. We need to pay more attention to teachers and doctors and less attention to private prison CEOs and the makers of prison technology. I realize that most of the listeners to this podcast might label these ideas as simply naive or even foolish, and I actually understand that. After all, we aren't just talking about ridding ourselves of those steel and concrete prisons, but also the societal conditions which create the impetus of crime itself. We are talking about fundamentally changing our cultural beliefs. There is no way to talk about this without sounding utopian. But it's okay to aim for utopia, I think. Maybe we fall short. We almost certainly fall short, as a matter of fact. But I'd rather fall short on that than fall short on some half-assed reform. We don't need better cages. We need no more cages. We need to aim for utopia and build a road to it operating under whatever political and cultural restraints and practicalities we encounter along the way. But the road must be built. We need to break through this cul-de-sac of inhumanity and punishment and actually move towards that utopia. The goal, in fact, is not just to disappear prisons, but to actually make them unnecessary. Strong communities create strong citizens. It's time to break these walls down and set this power free. And that, my friends, is the end of the episode. And I know that the subject I covered here is not that easy. It's not easy to think about. It's not easy even to talk about. This is so ingrained in our culture and our psyches that it's really difficult to kind of get our hands around it and grasp it. This idea that we don't need prisons anymore, or that we don't even need 99% of our prisons even. I know it's hard, but I'm asking you to consider it, think about it, let it marinate in your head. And listen, if you like stuff like this, subscribe wherever you are. If you're on YouTube, subscribe, thumbs up. And if you have a minute, hit that Apple link in the description, leave a rating and a review. That would be awesome. It's the best way to help us out. Thank you.